I've always believed that a man's land is his legacy, not just a piece of dirt to stand on, but a living record of his sweat, his blood, and the values he chose to live by. My grandfather bought the stretch of property that included the old bridge and the winding river back in the 1950s, long before luxury developers came sniffing around with their polished shoes and slick promises. For decades, it was just a simple, peaceful spot, a place where cattle graze, kids fished off the banks, and neighbors gathered for 4th of July cookouts. That bridge wasn't just a crossing point over water. It was part of my family's story. Built by my father's hands after floods swept away the original wooden crossing, the steel-reinforced structure stood as a symbol of grit and resilience. Growing up, I helped tighten the bolts, painted the beams when rust started creeping in, and even carved my initials into one of the supports when I was 12 years old. Every memory I held dear seemed tied to that bridge. So when the HOA decided it wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough for their gated community and sent their bulldozers to tear it down, they weren't just wrecking steel and concrete. They were ripping apart a piece of me. At first, I didn't even know what they were up to. I was working my land, minding my own business, when the sound of heavy machinery echoed through the valley. By the time I made my way down to the river, clouds of dust filled the air, and men in hard hats were shouting over the roar of engines. My bridge was in pieces, beams dangling like broken limbs, while a backhoe ripped at the supports. I shouted. I waved my arms. I even called the sheriff, but the HOA had already greased enough palms to make sure no one interfered. Their excuse? They claimed the bridge posed a hazard to community safety and interfered with the view of the lake homes they had built on the other side of the river. That was when I realized this wasn't just an accident or an overstep. It was an attack. They wanted to erase my presence, push me out, and claim control over land that wasn't theirs. And if there's one thing my father taught me, it's that a man who doesn't fight for what's his might as well roll over and let the world walk across his back like a doormat. I wasn't about to let that happen. In the days that followed, I walked the wreckage of the bridge like a battlefield. I could see the muddy tire tracks of their machines, the shards of metal scattered in the weeds, and the way the river now flowed unbothered, as if mocking me for being powerless. But powerless was the last thing I was. You see, I've spent most of my life learning not just how to work the land, but how to read the fine print, the contracts, the property lines that everyone else overlooks. My late-night hobby was studying deeds, easements, and county water rights. Some men collected stamps. Some played poker. Me, I learned the legal ins and outs of land ownership because I never wanted anyone to blindside me. So when the HOA destroyed my bridge, I didn't grab a shotgun or storm their meetings screaming for justice. No, I went to my office, pulled out the thick folder of maps and documents my grandfather had tucked away, and started piecing together a strategy that would make them regret ever underestimating me. The river was the key. Most of the lake homes in their multi-million-dollar development relied on the river's flow to keep the water level stable. Without it, the lakefront paradise they advertised in their glossy brochures would dry into nothing more than a muddy basin with stranded docks. What the HOA didn't realize was that my family never sold our rights to the river. The developers had assumed, wrongly, that the county had authority over it. But water rights in this part of the country can be as old as the land grants themselves, and in our case, they belong to me. I own not just a property where the bridge had stood, but the very veins of water that fed their artificial lake. All it took was one look at those deeds to confirm what I already suspected. I had the power to shut off their lifeline. I spent nights pacing my living room, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to march straight into their HOA boardroom, slam the papers on the table, and demand they rebuild my bridge with interest. But another part of me, the colder, calculating side, knew that wouldn't teach them a real lesson. If I simply forced them to replace the bridge, they'd still believe they held the upper hand, that they could dictate the terms of my life and property. No, I wanted something bigger, something permanent. If they wanted to tear down my legacy, I was going to choke out theirs. That's when the idea hit me. Buy the river outright, cut off the supply, and watch their $5 million homes lose every drop of value they were so proud of. It wasn't easy, of course. Even though I technically held rights, I had to navigate a maze of county bureaucracy to make sure every legal loophole was tied shut. I filed paperwork, met with old-timers who remember when my grandfather signed the original water rights documents, and tracked down dusty archives in the courthouse basement that hadn't been touched in decades. Each time I unearthed another piece of proof, my confidence grew. Meanwhile, I watched the HOA strut around like peacocks, holding wine parties by the lake, bragging about how their exclusive community was the jewel of the region. They had no idea the ground beneath their empire was hollow, and I was the one holding a hammer to crack it wide open. When I finally pulled the trigger on my plan, it started quietly. I didn't storm in waving flags or shouting about revenge. I just went down to county office, slid my paperwork across the clerk's desk, and let the system do what it was designed to do. The funny thing about bureaucracy is that it's slow when you want it fast, but lightning quick when someone thinks there's money involved. Within a month, my ownership of the river was locked in airtight, notarized, and recorded. Nobody could touch it without coming through me. I remember walking out of that office with the stamped documents tucked under my arm, and for the first time since they demolished my bridge, I felt the scales tipping back in my favor. The HOA thought they had crushed me, but they had just given me the motivation I needed to outthink them. From that day forward, I wasn't just a landowner. They had unknowingly turned me into the gatekeeper of their precious lakefront kingdom. The first step was subtle. I had a crew come in and build a diversion channel a few miles upstream. Nothing dramatic at first, just a controlled redirection of flow, so I could monitor how much water I could withhold without drawing immediate suspicion. I'd spent weeks studying the hydrology reports, making sure the lake could drop inch by inch without them realizing what was happening. The summer sun helped me out. With evaporation already nibbling at the edges, my small diversions looked like nothing more than nature doing her work. But I knew better. I could see the gradual lowering of the waterline, the exposed rocks, the muddy streaks creeping down the shorelines where boats used to float. To anyone else, it looked like a seasonal fluctuation. To me, it was the opening act of a long, calculated play. By the second month, whispers began spreading among the homeowners. I'd hear snippets when I stopped in town to diner or hardware store. Complaints about dock ladders no longer reaching the water. Frustration over algae blooms forming in shallow spots. Irritation that their pristine oasis didn't look so pristine anymore. I kept my head down, nodding politely, never letting on that I was a puppeteer behind their misery. Every time I overheard them whining, I thought back to the image of my bridge in ruins. Twisted metal tossed aside like garbage, and it'd steal my resolve. Let them feel inconvenience. Let them worry about their property values. Let them scramble for answers. They had taken something irreplaceable from me. Now I was taking the foundation of everything they held dear. Of course, the HOA board eventually caught wind that the issue was more serious than a dry summer. They hired experts to test the lake, sent drones flying overhead to survey the shoreline, and even hosted an emergency meeting to calm the homeowners' nerves. I wasn't invited, of course, but that didn't matter. I had a friend who worked maintenance in the community, an honest guy who couldn't stand the board's arrogance. He slipped me a copy of their internal newsletter, where the board reassured residents that the water levels were within natural variation and that everything was under control. Reading those words, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Under control? They had no clue what control even meant, and the tighter they tried to grip it, the faster it was going to slip through their fingers. Meanwhile, I doubled down. I invested in reinforced gates along the diversion channel, making it possible to choke the river flow almost completely if I wanted to. But I didn't shut it off all at once. I wasn't out to cause immediate collapse. No, I wanted this to be slow, excruciating, undeniable. The kind of loss that doesn't just sting but lingers, gnaws at you, keeps you awake at night. Every real estate agent selling those lake homes had promised buyers eternal waterfront luxury. Imagine the lawsuits, the screaming matches, the finger pointing when that promise evaporated along with the lake. It was more than revenge at this point. It was justice in its purest form. But the HOA didn't just sit back quietly. When the board realized the situation wasn't improving, they decided to flex their muscles. First, they sent me a formal letter accusing me of tampering with shared environmental resources. The letterhead was embossed, the language all stiff and legal, but at the heart of it, they were bluffing. I framed the letter on my wall, right next to a picture of my father standing proudly by the original bridge. It reminded me that I wasn't dealing with people who respected fairness or decency. I was dealing with bullies in suits, and bullies only understand strength. I wrote them back with a copy of my deed and water rights, highlighted in yellow, along with short note. You tore down my bridge. I own the river. This conversation is over. I never got a reply. For a while, I wondered if they'd come after me harder. Lawsuits, harassment, maybe even threats. But weeks passed, and instead of fighting me directly, they turned inward. The community meetings grew more frantic. The homeowners began blaming the board, and the board scrambled to find scapegoats. I sat on my porch in the evenings, sipping whiskey, listening to the faint echo of their chaos drifting across the valley like music. The same people who had laughed, sneered, and dismissed me as a relic of the past were now tearing themselves apart, trying to figure out why their million-dollar views were shrinking by the day. And I didn't have to lift a finger. They were doing all the dirty work for me. The turning point came one crisp autumn morning when I noticed a line of SUVs creeping down the private road that led to my property. Black Escalades, shiny BMWs, the kind of vehicles that screamed, "I have money and I expect everyone to know it." Out stepped half a dozen HOA board members, all dressed in their designer jackets and expensive shoes that were clearly not meant for trudging across muddy ground. They looked out of place, like city folks lost in the countryside, but the smug expressions on their faces told me they thought they were about to intimidate me into submission. I leaned against my fence post, arms crossed, watching them gather as if they were about to hold a corporate meeting right there in the dirt. Their spokesperson, a tall, silver-haired man named Richard who fancied himself a natural leader, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the matter of the river," he said, his tone condescending, as if I were some ignorant farmhand. "You're causing irreparable harm to our community, and we demand you restore the water flow immediately. If you don't, we'll be forced to pursue alternatives." I let him talk. I let every one of them chime in, their voices rising in frustration, their threats becoming bolder with each passing second. One woman even wagged her finger at me, declaring that I was destroying the property values of hard-working families. Hard-working, my foot. These were the same people who held wine tastings while contractors built their homes on land they didn't care about, who voted to tear down my bridge without so much as a courtesy call. I waited until they'd exhausted themselves before I spoke, my voice calm but edged with steel. "You came onto my land uninvited," I said, staring Richard dead in the eye. "You tore down my bridge. You disrespected my family's history. And now you're standing here demanding I hand you the very thing that keeps your lake alive. Tell me, why should I?" The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard's face turned red, whether from anger or embarrassment I couldn't tell, and he sputtered something about legal obligations and community agreements. That's when I pulled the deed from my jacket pocket and held it up. The papers flapped in the wind like a battle flag, every signature, stamp, and clause visible. "This," I said, "isn't just a piece of paper. This is the law. This is mine. And unless you plan on rewriting history, you have nothing. Absolutely nothing." They didn't like that answer. I could see the cracks forming in their confidence, but instead of backing down, they doubled down. One board member muttered something about filing for eminent domain. Another said they'd bring in state officials. And a third even suggested suing me personally for damages. I almost laughed in their faces. They thought they were the first people to threaten me with lawyers and paperwork. My grandfather used to say, "A man who hides behind lawyers is just another man who can't swing his own hammer." And these people, they couldn't swing a hammer if their lives depended on it. After they finally left, tires spinning in the dirt as they sped away, I knew the battle lines had been drawn. They weren't going to stop, and neither was I. The difference was I had patience on my side. Water moves slow, but it shapes mountains over time. I decided that no matter what tricks they tried to pull, I'd be the one dictating the flow, literally and figuratively. Over the next few weeks, the HOA launched a smear campaign against me. They printed newsletters painting me as a bitter old recluse, a selfish man hoarding resources, even a danger to the environment. They tried to frame me as the villain, hoping public opinion would force my hand. But here's the thing. They underestimated just how much goodwill my family had built in this county over generations. Local folks remember the bridge my father built, the hay we donated to neighbors during droughts, the times we opened our fields for charity events. When the HOA tried to turn the town against me, they found themselves facing blank stares and cold shoulders. Out here, loyalty means more than money, and I had loyalty in spades. Still, their desperation grew. They started calling emergency board meetings twice a week, spending thousands on lawyers and consultants, even bringing in so-called hydrology experts to testify that my diversions were unnatural. But the evidence was ironclad, and every time they tried to corner me legally, I had the documentation to shut them down. Each victory only fueled me further. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore. I was dismantling their empire piece by piece, watching their million-dollar investments shrivel like raisins in the sun. By late autumn, the lake had dropped so low that boats sat stranded on dry mud. Homeowners who had once bragged about waterfront views now looked out over cracked earth and weeds. For sale signs began popping up, though no buyers came calling. Realtors avoided the area like the plague, knowing the HOA's jewel of the region was quickly becoming an eyesore. And me? I stood on my porch each evening, watching the sun dip behind the hills, the dry lake bed glowing orange in the twilight, and I thought to myself, this is justice. This is what happens when you tear down a man's bridge and think there won't be consequences. Winter rolled in hard that year, and with it came a new kind of silence. Where once the HOA's lake had been alive with the hum of boat engines and the laughter of weekend parties, now there was nothing but wind scraping across the cracked surface of what used to be water. The docks sagged like skeletons, their pilings exposed to the bitter air, and the glossy brochures that once promised serenity and waterfront living were nothing more than lies rotting in realtor offices. I'd walk down to the edge sometimes, just to look at it all, and I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. They had destroyed my bridge because it didn't fit the image of their pristine community. And now, thanks to me, their image was a wasteland. But the HOA didn't give up, not yet. Desperation has a way of making people reckless. In December, I got served with papers, an official lawsuit claiming that my actions had caused catastrophic damages to the community, totaling in the tens of millions. They accused me of everything from negligence to malicious intent. When I finished reading the stack of documents, I set them down on the kitchen table and laughed until my ribs hurt. They really thought they could sue me into submission, that the threat of losing money would scare me off. What they didn't realize was that my land was paid off decades ago, my debts were zero, and my livelihood wasn't tied to the whims of investors or property values. They had nothing to take from me that I wasn't willing to lose. I hired a lawyer anyway, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to make the fight official. My attorney was a grizzled old bulldog named Hank, a man who'd been practicing law in the county for 40 years and knew every judge, every clerk, every backdoor in the system. When I slid the papers across his desk, he read through them with a slow, deliberate calm. Then he leaned back, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "They don't have a leg to stand on. This isn't about law, it's about ego." That was all I needed to hear. We filed our response, countersuing for the illegal demolition of my bridge and emotional damages tied to it. For the first time since this whole mess started, the HOA realized they weren't the only ones who knew how to weaponize paperwork. Court dates were set for the spring, but in the meantime, I kept the river under lock and key. I made sure every valve, every gate, every diversion was secure. I wasn't about to let them sneak in and tamper with my work. I even hired a couple of trustworthy ranch hands to patrol the area, just in case the board decided to get creative. Sure enough, in January, one of my guys caught two men in suits wandering near the diversion channel with measuring equipment. They claimed they were environmental consultants, but they didn't have permits, and they sure as hell didn't have permission. We escorted them off the property, and I made it clear that next time, the sheriff would be involved. Word must have spread quickly, because after that, the trespassing stopped. What surprised me most during those long winter months wasn't the HOA's persistence. It was the homeowners themselves. A few of them, the more reasonable ones, started reaching out to me directly. They came by in pickup trucks, not SUVs, and they knocked on my door with hats in hand. One man, a retired veteran who'd bought a modest cabin on the lake, admitted he had nothing to do with the board's decision to tear down my bridge. He told me he'd even voted against some of their proposals, but he'd been overruled by the majority. "I just wanted a quiet place to fish," he said, his voice heavy with regret. I believed him, and though I didn't promise anything, I listened. Not everyone in that community was my enemy, but the ones who had orchestrated the bridge demolition, they were going to feel every ounce of the weight I carried. As spring thawed the land, the lawsuit heated up. The HOA showed up in court with their expensive attorneys, armed with charts, graphs, and binders full of accusations. They painted me as a vengeful recluse hellbent on destroying innocent homeowners. But when it was my turn, Hank stood tall, his voice carrying like thunder. He laid out the history of my family's ownership, the deeds proving my water rights, and the blatant illegality of tearing down my bridge without permission. Then he did something brilliant. He brought in old photographs, pictures of my father building the bridge, of neighborhood kids playing by the river, of community barbecues held on the very land the HOA had disrespected. The jury wasn't looking at a bitter old man anymore. They were looking at a legacy under attack. And when Hank ended with, "My client didn't take their water," he simply stopped giving them a gift they were never entitled to. I knew the tide had turned. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the outcome became clearer with every passing day. The HOA was exposed as arrogant and overreaching, their legal arguments crumbling under the weight of hard evidence. By the time the judge issued his ruling, I wasn't just vindicated, I was victorious. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for the unlawful destruction of my bridge, cover all court costs, and acknowledge my exclusive rights to the river. It was more than a win. It was a public humiliation, a message carved in stone for everyone to see. You don't mess with man's land, and you sure as hell don't mess with his family's history. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing on the riverbank one quiet morning, the spring sun warming my back and the sound of water rushing steady and strong in my ears. The fight with the HOA had consumed months of my life, drained energy I didn't know I still had, and tested every ounce of patience my father ever taught me. But as I looked at the papers in my hand, the judge's ruling in my favor, the official recognition of my family's water rights, I felt something I hadn't felt since before they tore down my bridge. Peace. The HOA had tried to strip me of my history, tried to turn me into a footnote in their glossy version of progress. Instead, I'd turned their empire into dust, and I had done it without firing a shot or raising a fist. I had done it with persistence, patience, and the unshakable belief that right is right, even when the world is stacked against you. The aftermath was almost poetic. The HOA board members who once strutted around like kings were suddenly silent, their reputation shattered. Word of their defeat spread far beyond the county lines, and developers who had once courted them with promises of new expansions began pulling out. Their grand plans to turn the valley into a luxury paradise crumbled overnight. Property values plummeted. Realtors abandoned listings, and homeowners who had once bragged about living in the premier lakeside community found themselves stuck with worthless mansions overlooking a half-dead lake. Some tried to sell, some simply walked away, and a few, like the retired veteran I'd spoken to, chose to stay, humbled by the collapse of the dream they'd been sold. As for the bridge they'd torn down, I used part of the damages awarded by the court to rebuild it, stronger and more resilient than before. Not because I needed it for travel, but because it stood as a symbol, a monument to my father, my grandfather, and to the stubborn truth that you don't erase history by bulldozing it. I won't lie. There were moments during that fight when I questioned whether it was worth it. Nights when I lay awake, wondering if I should have just let it go, let the river flow as it always had, and spare myself the stress. But then I'd remember the look of smug satisfaction on their faces as they tore my bridge apart. The arrogance of people who thought money and bylaws gave them the right to trample on a man's legacy. That memory fueled me, sharpened my resolve, and carried me through every sleepless night. And, in the end, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who's ever been told to step aside, to make way, to accept loss because someone with deeper pockets said so. My fight became their fight, and my victory became a message carved deeper than any deed or ruling. Some things can't be bought, bullied, or buried. These days, life is quieter again. I tend my land, walk the rebuilt bridge, and sit by the river knowing it flows because I allow it to, not because someone else thinks they control it. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at the irony. The very thing they tried to take from me became the weapon that destroyed them. And every time I see the water rushing past, I think of my father's words. A man's land is his legacy. Mine is intact. Theirs is gone. And I wouldn't trade places with them for all the money in the world.